Welcome back, everyone. Today was the 5th round of the Tata Steel Masters Chess Tournament. Now, as we know, Magnus Carlsen lost in the 4th round to Anish Giri, which put him on 2 points out of 4, or an even score. Now, in the 5th round, he had the white piece against Norbek Abdusattorov, a rising junior from Uzbekistan. Now, Norbek and Magnus have played in the past. I don't know if the most recent encounter was a World Rapid Chess Championship last year, but they did play in Poland in the World Rapid Championship in 2021 at the end of the year. And in that event, Magnus actually lost to Norbek, I believe, with the black pieces. So they have a bit of a history. Norbek has scored well against Magnus in the past. Would Magnus end up in trouble for a second game in a row, potentially lose, or would he right the ship? Let's dive right into the game. So the game starts with the move c4 from Magnus. We get c5 from Norbek, playing the symmetrical English opening. Knight f3, knight f6, knight to c3, knight to 6, all pretty standard. Both players bringing out their ponies early. And now we get e3, and Norbek plays this move e5 here. Now, this is the first sort of deviation. White can play e3. White can also play d4 here. Magnus has actually won quite a few games in this line with takes e6, and a3 in the past, but he elects to play a different variation this time around by playing e3. So we get e3, e5, trying to contest the center here, so white cannot play d4. Bishop to e2 is played. d5 takes, and now we have what is called the Maroczy bind setup. Black has these 2 pawns on c5 and e5, which cover the d4 square. However, as we must note, this is a Sicilian reverse, so even though black gets the Maroczy bind structure, white has an extra tempo. So we get castles, bishop to e7, and now Magnus goes bishop to b5, threatening to capture the pawn on e5, because let's just say black plays a move like rook to b8, for example. White can play knight takes e5. Knight cannot capture the knight on e5 because that would hang your king on e8. So we get knight takes c3, b takes c3, queen c7 played by Norbek, guarding the pawn on e5. We get pawn to d4. Obviously, with white having these 2 pawns here on c3 and e3, you can try to fight for the center immediately. We get c takes d4, c takes d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, and now bishop to d7 from Norbek. And here we've reached the first sort of, I don't want to say independent position, but this first moment of the game where there are different branches or paths of which white can go down. So here Magnus plays this move knight to f3. Now, probably what he should have done is he probably should have played this move queen to c2, because the idea is black cannot capture the knight because then you lose your queen on c7. And after black castles here, you can go bishop b2. Let's say black plays rook a c8, for example, and after knight to f5, white is going to end up a little bit better here with the bishop pair, these 2 bishops on b5 and b2, and some ideas to maybe attack on these diagonals like bishop d3, putting pressure on h7, maybe queen g4 as well. So white has some play here, and white should be a little bit better. However, Magnus chooses to play knight f3 instead, and I suspect this was based on a couple of things. I suspect that Magnus played knight f3 because he wanted to keep more pieces on the board after losing in the 4th round, and so he thought that basically after castles he could play something like bishop b2, maybe rook c1, maybe bishop d3, and try to get something similar. Again, even this is not really all that special for white, so it's definitely a little bit surprising that he did this, but I suspect that he was trying to keep more pieces on the board to generate more chances of winning the game. So after knight f3, we got bishop f6, and here Magnus plays another very interesting move, which is bishop to a3. Magnus could have also played the more obvious move, rook to b1, avoiding the bishop capturing it on a1. And after rook b1 castles, white probably plays something like bishop to b2, trade and rook takes b2, and once again, white is very slightly better due to a better pawn structure here, and potential ideas like queen b1 and bishop to d3 to attack the pawn on b7, maybe rook c1, maybe rook d2 and rook d1 with double stacks later. So white is a touch better here, but once again, it's not exactly a conclusive advantage. And for Magnus, after losing yesterday, I think not yesterday, sorry, I should say 2 days ago, and losing to Anish, I think he really wanted to try to keep as many pieces on the board, try to keep the game as complicated as possible, and so he chose not to play this rook to b1 move. Instead, he goes bishop to a3. We get bishop takes a1 here. Now, the idea behind bishop a3 quite straightforward. Black cannot castle the king from e8 to g8 here because that would be an illegal move. You cannot castle the king through check. So if black wants to castle, he would have to castle to the queen side. However, if you castle the queen side right away after a move like bishop d6, queen to a5, and I want to say like queen b3 or maybe a4 even, white should be doing very well here. White has great bishops on b5 and d6. You can play rook c1 later, and after bishop takes a1, queen takes a1, followed by rook to c1. This bishop on d6 is incredibly powerful, and white should simply be winning. So Noterbeck follows the principles. He takes the rook right away. We get queen a1, and now he castles. Now, one of the differences between this position and what we just looked at is that the bishop on a3 is not getting to this d6 square because the queen is not on d1 to support the move. So after castles, we get rook c1, king to b8 is played here, and now Magnus takes the pawn. Again, white has given up a rook for a bishop here, so even though you're trying to do stuff, you have to be very, very quick, because if black is able to consolidate, say you play h3, f6, for example, and I don't know, like bishop b2, rook c8, followed by rook d8, black has an extra rook for a bishop, and long term, black will be able to consolidate his position and win this game. So Magnus snaps the pawn on g7. We get rook to g8 here. Logical move with the idea of putting pressure on the g file potentially. Magnus plays queen to b2. We get bishop to g4 being played, and it's worth noting that queen to b2 is actually a mistake. In typical computer fashion, it likes to move queen takes h7. Now, this is a very hard move to play for a couple of reasons. First of all, as a human, it looks like black has bishop g4, because if you take on c6 with the bishop here, black can take with the queen, and if you play rook takes queen, you get ice skated. There's rook to d1 check, knight e1, and rook takes e1, and the king is stuck on g1, so that would be losing. So if you take and black takes, you have a lot of problems here because bishop takes f3 is in play, queen takes c1, threatening the checkmate still exists. So you don't really want to do that. However, if you play the move bishop to e2, guarding the knight, black can now go bishop takes f3, and rook to h8, and black is going to win this pawn at h2. Now, the computer actually thinks that after a move like queen c2, queen takes h2, king f1, followed by king e2, white's king is very safe on e2, and white should be okay. But again, for us humans, in the moment, it looks really, really scary to just snap this pawn because of ideas like bishop g4 and rook h8, and you just assume there's probably something wrong. So Magnus plays queen b2, but this is a clear blunder, because Noterbeck correctly plays bishop g4. Magnus goes knight e1. Once again, you cannot take the knight, because after queen takes, or it's not that you can't take, but after queen takes, you cannot take the rook because there's rook d1, knight e1, rook takes e1. And once again, you have the classic back rank checkmate. So we get knight to e1 played by Magnus, rook to d1, another perfect move by Noterbeck here, because as we look at the position, white has one bishop and one pawn for the rook here. But white has great bishops on b5 and a3, a lot of pressure on the c file and b file. So if you're looking at this position from Noterbeck's perspective, if you can trade off heavy materials, specifically rooks or queens, that is going to make it a lot easier to play. If it goes rook d1, the rooks come off the board. Now we get bishop to f1. And already here, black is clearly better, because with the rook for the bishop, you can take the d file or the c file. There are ideas like knight e5 and knight f3 as well. With correct play, black should be in the driver's seat. So Noterbeck plays knight to e5, which to me, at least on first glance, looks very human. Computer doesn't like it, but it seems like the natural move. So we get pawn to h3 played by Magnus. Couple of reasons. First of all, it stops knight to g4 and queen to h2 checkmate. Just to illustrate it, after queen b1, knight to g4, there's this pesky threat of queen takes h2 checkmate. So by going h3, you stop knight g4. Knight f3 isn't really a big threat because you can simply trade and then go queen to f6 here. And g2 is guarded by the bishop. You have this idea with bishop d6 as well, and white should be completely fine. So bishop to f3 is played by Noterbeck, which is apparently, again, another blunder, but a move that to me at least makes a lot of sense. Computer actually liked bishop to h5 with the idea of going bishop g6, but don't ask me why it's the best move. So we got bishop to f3, queen to d4 is played. Now it's worth noting white cannot take the bishops after knight takes bishop, knight takes knight with check. You cannot capture the knight because that puts your king in check. And after king to h1, once again, we have the classic queen h2 checkmate. So the computer here actually thinks that after queen b1, white should be okay. I think primarily because after black moves the bishop back to, like, say c6, for example, white can snap this pawn on h7, and now white has two pawns and a bishop for the rook, and white is very much in the game. But again, not an easy move to find, and Magnus doesn't find it. He plays the much more obvious and human-looking queen d4, threatening to go bishop d6 and winning a lot of material. Noterbeck plays rook d8 to attack the queen and stop bishop to d6. We get queen to h4 here, and now bishop to d5. Queen takes h7. But the difference here versus the other variation is that there is no longer a rook on g8 under attack. So black can consider taking on a2, but also playing bishop to c4, because now you can bring this rook down to d1 and go after the knight on e1, the bishop on f1, and the king on g1 as well. And already here, even though the computer thinks that white is kind of on the edge of being okay, it really feels very, very scary. So Magnus goes bishop to b2. You get bishop takes f1, king takes f1 is played, queen c4, king to g1, knight to c6, putting the knight on a square where it's guarded by the pawn. Now black wants to simply go queen e2, or rook to d1 here to win a lot of material, and it's already very hard to play. Magnus plays knight to f3, Noterbeck takes on a2, we get bishop to f6, rook to d1, king to h2, and now this move a5. Now the dust has cleared a little bit here. Again, we've had a little bit of a transition. Black has two connected passed pawns on the queen side, which can just run right down the board. White, however, is a very safe king here. You've got a lot of pawns around the king, so it's a question of whether Black can push these pawns down the board quick enough to create threats before White can try to push the h pawn up the board, or maybe go queen g8 and get some bishop d4 check down the road and go hunting for the black king. So we get knight to d4 here. Noterbeck plays queen to d5. We get queen c2 being played here, and I want to say that queen c2 is maybe not the fatal blunder, but it's the blunder after which I think for humans there is no coming back. In this position, the only way to try and save it would have been queen to g7, because now after black plays a move like a4, you can trade and you can try to go bishop d4 here, setting up the classic wooden shield. Obviously you have queen f8 and queen g8, and maybe you can go h4, h5, h6. Again, black is still better after b6, but I think they're very good practical chances for white to be able to draw this game. However, Magnus plays this move queen c2 instead, attacking the rook on d1, and now Noterbeck correctly plays the move queen to d6 check, attacking the bishop on f6, as well as the king on h2, and Magnus goes f4. Noterbeck plays rook takes knight. Perfect move here. Bishop takes. You get knight takes. You cannot take with a pawn, of course, because I would just take the bishop. So he takes with the bishop. There's a trade, takes g3, and queen takes d4. Now, the reason that I said that was the last realistic chance I think for a human to save is because now the dust has completely settled, and then we've transitioned to a queen and pawn endgame where black has an extra pawn. He actually has two connected on the queen side, but with the extra pawn, the queen perfectly centralized, creating a wooden shield and a sun ray at the same time. Also covering the h8 square, which is the queening square, combined with a4, a3. This queen is just perfectly centralized here, and white, realistically, even though a computer could probably draw this, I think for a human, the game is already over. So we get h4. a4 is played here by Noterbeck, again trying to just rush the pawn up the board. We get queen to a2, preventing black from pushing the pawn to a3. Noterbeck plays f5, avoiding the capture from the queen on a2, taking on f7. We get h5 here, and now Noterbeck plays a move here that's interesting. He goes queen h8. Now the computer does not like this move, but it's a move that to me makes a lot of sense, because when you play queen to h8, the idea is that you want to stop white from getting this h pawn all the way up the board. There are ideas like queen to g8. So say, for example, just to illustrate, say you go b5 and you get h6. These ideas with queen g8 and h7 are very scary, and your king is a little bit open. It's vulnerable to checks on both g8, f7, as well as e6. So queen to h8 is a way of basically saying, look, I'll give you the a pawn for the h pawn, but I'll still have two pawns to one, and then you will never be able to get a passed pawn. So after queen to h8, Magnus makes what I would say is the absolute last blunder in my opinion, even though it's still technically a draw according to the computer, which is he captures the pawn. If Magnus had played queen to f7 here after a3 and king h3, it's still probably very bad, or not king h3, sorry, king g2 I think is the move that I was thinking of, because after a2 takes in this position, white is able to go queen g8 with queen d5 or queen a2, and white maybe has a prayer of surviving. At any rate, Magnus just takes on a4. We get queen takes h5, king to g1, and now let's move queen to f3, which is a great move because it guards the pawn on f5, it attacks the pawn on g3, but more importantly, it also keeps this king very boxed in here. If I could magically, let's just say, put this king, I'm just going to make some random moves here. If I could magically put this white king on, say, d2, for example, you get some position like this. Even a position like this is probably a draw because the king can run over to the queen side and stop the b pawn. But with the king being stuck here on g1, the king is boxed. Black will be able to run the king up the board and avoid the checks eventually. This is very hard to play. So we get king to h2, queen e2, king to g1 is played. Not king to h3, by the way, because after king to h3, now black can, I thought black could play b5, but maybe just queen f1, king h4, and now let's move b5. Queen guards both pawns. Of course, it's a classic right triangle. You have queen c4 check as well, and maybe queen f3, queen g4 additionally. So it's all about geometry here, but this should be winning. So after queen e2, we get king g1. Queen to e5 played by Noterbeck, attacks the pawn on g3, guards the pawn on f5, also stops queen to e8 check and queen to f4 check. So white cannot check the black king on b8. So we get king to f2, b5. Now you try to run the pawn. We get queen b4, king b7, g4 played here by Magnus. Already here, this position is completely lost. And the reason it's lost, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, the problem is the king is on a dark square. So say I play a move like queen a3, for example, you get king b6. The problem is all these checks on the dark squares like c5 and d4. Additionally, I can start to push the pawn. So like if you go like queen a8, just to illustrate it, here I can even go b4 because you have no check on b8, or even queen to c5 because now all the light squares are out of play. If you go to g2, I just play queen c6, trade, and run the b pawn down the board. Same applies to f3. Maybe you can go king e2, but again, after b4, black will run the king up the board, and this should just be winning. So already here, it's probably lost. We get g4 from Magnus, trading the pawns, but after queen takes g4, king b6, with the queen and pawn versus the queen, similar to rook and pawn endgames, the white king is cut off. Now, it's worth noting that top grandmasters do study a lot of these queen and pawn endgames, but this one is completely hopeless. So the only situation where you have a chance to maybe save this position would be, let me just set it up, is if I could magically put the king somewhere down here, let's say, and I'll just illustrate the point. Let's just say we got some position where the king is all the way on h8. Now, this position is losing, but there have been some endgames, for example, that have been played. Let's just say, let me just set this up here. You got some position like this, like this, for example, and this is losing for white, but there have been examples where players have been able to save it. I believe there was a game that was played in one of the Grand Chess Tour events. I think it was 2017 or 18 between Wesley So and Vishwanathan Anand, where with the queen and the pawn versus the queen in this setup, I believe that Vishy had the extra pawn. He was unable to win this endgame, but the only reason that there are tricks in endgames like this is very specifically because at some point you end up you end up in some situation. Let me just put this back here just to illustrate it. There's situations like this which can occur where basically you just leave your queen hanging, allowing the stalemate idea to exist, and it's still tricky for black to win these positions because you always have this idea with queen f6, queen f7, etc. Mind you, it is a theoretical win, but there are chances to save it if your king is all the way up here. But if we look at this position back here, you'll notice that the king is on the wrong side. The king cannot get here, so there are no ideas with stalemate because trying to put a king in the corner and the queen on f2 doesn't really do anything here. Again, very, very advanced. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but the only chance to save this endgame with the queen and pawn versus the queen would be if the white king was in this corner with h7 or h8. We get king b5, Magnus goes king g2, queen e2, king g3, queen e3, king g2, and now b3. Again, Noterbeck has no reason to be afraid here because he can always hide the king in front of the pawn. So even though white can start checking, you can start checking kind of all over the board. You can always hide the king in front of the pawn like this construction. And now if white ever checks, you block and trade. And if white moves the queen, let's just say f8, once again, you can slowly start to zigzag and push the pawn up the board. So we get b3, we get queen to b8 being played here, king c4, check, king c3, check, we get king d2, queen h8, king to c2, queen to c8, king to d1. Very, very important move here, by the way. Once again, it's all about geometry. Because of where the white king is here, white cannot check. If you check on the d7 square, I go queen d2, forcing a trade of the queens, and then I will just push the pawn and make a new queen. If you go queen g4 check, I go queen e2 check, again offering the trade of the queens. So basically what black tries to do in these endgames is you try to put the king on a square where it can't be checked because you can interpose, or you hide the king in front of the pawn until you get the pawn down to the second rank. So after king d1, queen h8 is played by Magnus to stop b2. Get queen d2 check, and here Magnus makes the last blunder. It's already lost anyway, but he goes king to g3 here. He could have played king to g1 hoping to survive, but once again after b2, queen to h5 check, king to c1, queen to c5 here. There's queen to c2 check, queen g5, and now you go king to b1, threatening to go queen c1 and force a trade of the queens. White has to play a move like queen d5 here, and after queen c3, queen to e4, you go king c1, queen f4, king c2. I believe after queen e4, now you can, I believe you can hide the king on b3, and after queen b7, queen b4, queen to d5 here, you go queen c4, queen b7, and now you go king c2, queen g2, and I believe, is it king c1 here? Maybe, actually no, it's king c3, because now you can't check on g7 because of queen d4 check, and if you go queen to f3, for example, there's queen d3, king d2, and then king c1, which is winning. So king g1 would have given Magnus a faint glimmer of hope, but he plays king g3 instead. And now after b2, it's simple geometry here. Magnus is completely lost. There's no way to stop the pawn. If you play queen to h1 check, I have queen e1, forcing the trade of the queens. If you go queen to h5 check, for example, I can go king to c2. And once again, I'm threatening the queen, but all your checks get met by a queen block. If you check on c5, I check on c3. If you check on f5, I check on d3. Check on g6 or h7, exact same thing. I interpose with queen d3, and then I make a new queen. So after b2, queen h5 doesn't work, and the last one is you can play queen h7 here, but after queen h7, black can go queen c3 check. If you go back to any of these three squares on the second rank, I go queen c2, interposing, and once again winning with the pawn on b2. And if you go to the fourth rank, let's just say f4, I can go queen to b4 check, checking the king, and then I just make a new queen. The queen on b4 guards the pawn, becoming the new queen, and that would be a simple win as well. So after b2, Magnus has to resign here, and he loses a second game in a row to Noterbek Abdusattorov. A very, very big result for Noterbek. A very, very good game. There were obviously some mistakes in the middle game, but when push came to shove, he did not buckle under the pressure or under the sort of the threat of compensation. He played a very clean game overall, and he gets a second. He gets a big win over Magnus here. Magnus' second loss in a row. Noterbek takes the clear lead in the Tata Steel Masters now. He has 4 points out of 5. He's off to a great start. Once again, there are 13 rounds, so we're not even halfway through the event. So we'll see if he can keep it up. But at any rate, he's off to a fantastic start, and it's going to be exciting to watch him down the home stretch. Additionally, for Magnus, it's been, I think, a long time. I don't think he has ever lost 2 games in a row, at least in the A section of the Tata Steel Masters. So 2 losses in a row, very, very difficult. I don't really know what to say. It feels like he's maybe over pressing a little bit. He overpressed it, he gets punished for his choices. So we'll see what he can do. Obviously, it's a very unfamiliar situation to see Magnuson. He has 2 points out of 5. He's definitely towards the bottom of the leaderboard, but he is still the world champion. He is a player who, when his back is against the wall, when he's lost games in the past, he tends to find a way to overcome it. That being said, it's going to be very difficult here because he loses today with white. He's going to get black in the next round. It's obviously much harder to win games with black than white if your opponents don't take big risks. So we'll see what Magnus has in store, but it's been a very exciting start, and it's certainly somewhat unprecedented, but we'll see how the rest of the event goes. At any rate, you guys, I hope you have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below. We'll try to keep bringing you some more recaps from the Tata Steel Masters tournament as it progresses. At any rate, I hope you have enjoyed this recap, and we'll keep bringing you all the great content here on YouTube. I will see you guys soon. Have a good one. Bye.